across the wide African plains, where life and death often sit only a breath apart, one faint, broken cry made two rangers stop in their tracks. They had no idea the dying little creature at their feet would pull them into a story unlike anything the wild had ever seen. A story about love, about instincts turned upside down, and about the moment nature itself seemed to bow to compassion. And it all began with a tiny, fading baby gorilla lying in the dust. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Botswana plains, casting a long golden hush across the tall grass. Ethan McCarthy had walked these paths for years, long enough to know the sound of every bird, the weight of every breeze, and the quiet warnings the savanna whispered when something wasn't right. On that day, the wind carried a different kind of silence, one that made the back of his neck tighten. He stopped mid-stride, raising a hand to signal Talia Reyes behind him. She paused, her binoculars lowering slowly as she followed his line of sight across the rust-colored earth, where a faint, uneven trail cut through the dust like a wound. Ethan moved first, stepping into the trail, crouching to run 2 fingers along the disturbed soil. It wasn't the dragging mark of an injured adult animal. It was lighter, smaller, something that had stumbled, crawled, then collapsed, over and over again. Talia approached beside him, and the worry in her voice trembled before she even finished the sentence. "This is fresh, maybe an hour old." Whatever it was desperate. Ethan didn't respond. His eyes were already following the trail further ahead, where the grass thinned and the air grew strangely still, as if the land itself held its breath. They found the baby gorilla lying just beyond a patch of scorched brush, its tiny chest rising in shallow, quivering breaths. Dust clung to its fur. One arm was twisted unnaturally against its body. The little creature tried to move when it sensed them, but only managed a weak, broken sound, more a sigh than a cry. Ethan's heart clenched. He had seen death 100 times in the wild, but this was the kind that struck a man behind the ribs, the kind he could never get used to. He knelt slowly, bringing himself down to the small creature's level, letting it see his face, letting it feel something, someone that wasn't trying to kill it. Talia sank to her knees beside him. The disbelief in her eyes turned into dread as she scanned the ground. She spotted them first, tire marks, deep and fresh, overlapping each other in messy arcs. And beside them, boot prints, heavy, patterned, a brand she knew all too well. "Night riders," she whispered, as if saying the name out loud might make the shadows around them stir. For months, that group of nighttime poachers had roamed the borders of the reserve, shooting whatever they pleased, stripping what they could carry, and driving off before rangers could respond. They were ghosts, in the dark, and now, it seemed, they had left a fading life behind them. Ethan carefully pressed 2 fingers to the gorilla's ribs. The breaths were faint. The skin around its lips was pale. A tremor ran through the tiny body. He lifted the injured arm gently and felt the soft give of bone beneath the skin, broken, maybe in more than one place. The creature's fur smelled of fear and dust and long hours under a brutal sun. "This little one didn't just fall," Ethan murmured. "It ran, or tried to." He looked out across the plains, imagining the terror that must have driven such a fragile thing so far on its own. Something terrible had happened, something the gorilla was too young to understand, but desperate enough to outrun. Talia tried her satellite phone, tapping the cracked screen with shaking hands. The signal flickered, then dropped to nothing. She checked the battery, 4%. "We can't wait for pickup," she said quietly. "If we try to carry him back now, the cold alone will kill him before night." Ethan didn't argue. He knew the truth too well. A baby gorilla, without its mother's warmth, without constant touch and milk, couldn't survive more than a few hours. The plains would turn cold fast once the sun fell. The wind would scrape the heat off anything alive. Even wrapped in coats, carried close, the little one wouldn't make it to camp. Ethan lifted the gorilla gently, and the baby's fingers curled around the fabric of his shirt, gripping with what little strength remained. That single motion, instinctive, pleading, hit Ethan harder than any blow. He had carried wounded animals before, but never one so small, so alone, so unmistakably aware that its life depended on the warmth in his hands. Talia swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "We have to do something," she whispered. "But what? The sanctuary is too far. The mobile unit can't reach us until morning. We can't keep him alive through the night, Ethan. We just can't." Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood there holding the little gorilla, feeling the faint tremors of fear and exhaustion ripple through the small body. He stared out over the savanna toward a cluster of acacia trees in the distance. He had passed that area earlier in the week and had seen something most people would not have believed if he told them. A lioness named Mara, unusually gentle, nursing 2 small cubs and displaying a kind of patience and calm he'd rarely seen in any predator. She was different. In quiet moments, she had seemed almost tender. Talia noticed Ethan's distant look and stepped closer. "What is it?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening as the thought he'd been avoiding pressed its way forward. There's one chance," he said quietly. "But it's a long shot, a dangerous one." Talia frowned. "What kind of chance?" Ethan took a breath, steadying the gorilla in his arms. "Mara, the lioness. She's close. She's nursing. She's unusual. If anyone out here might accept a helpless creature that's not her own—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Talia's eyes widened in horror before he could say more. "No," she said immediately. "Ethan, no. She's still a lion. She'll kill him in seconds." Ethan's voice was low, steady, but firm. "If we keep him, he dies tonight. If we take him to her, maybe he has a chance, a slim one, but better than none." Talia shook her head, tears threatening. "That's not a plan. That's a gamble with a life that already barely exists." Ethan looked down at the baby gorilla, whose small fingers still clung to his shirt as though begging not to be left alone again. Then he looked at Talia. "I know, but we're out of time. And this little one, he deserves a chance, even if it's a crazy one." The wind shifted then, carrying the faint scent of distant animals, the rustling of grass, and something else, something heavy and quiet, like the savanna, waiting to see what choice they would make. Ethan didn't hesitate any more. He adjusted his grip on the tiny gorilla, nodded once to Talia, and began walking toward the acacia grove where a lioness waited with her own young. Talia followed, her steps reluctant but determined, her heart pounding in her chest. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long across the earth as the 2 rangers carried the fragile life toward a mother that did not belong to his kind, praying the wild would show a mercy it rarely did. They walked in silence at first, the kind of silence that presses on a man's shoulders heavier than any pack. The grass brushed against Ethan's legs as he carried the baby gorilla close to his chest, feeling every weak breath against his skin. The little one had stopped making sounds. Even the small, broken whimpers were gone now. That scared him more than anything. A crying animal still had fight left. The quiet ones were the ones slipping away. Talia walked a step behind, her boots scuffing the dry earth. Every few seconds she glanced over her shoulder as if expecting the night riders to roar back over the horizon on their bikes. Headlights cutting through the dust, rifles pointed out like fingers of death. She knew they were gone, for now, but the memory of the boot prints and tire marks clung to her thoughts like a bad smell. People did this, she kept thinking. People did this. And here we are, begging a lioness to be kinder than our own kind. The sun kept dropping, sliding toward the rim of the world, pulling the warmth with it. Long shadows stretched out from every bush and rock, and the air, once hot enough to sting the lungs, began to cool. Ethan felt the baby gorilla shiver. He shifted the small body inside his shirt, tucking it in closer, like a father trying to warm a sick child. "Easy, little guy," he murmured. "Just a little farther. Stay with me." One of the small hands twitched, fingers curling weakly, and for a moment Ethan let himself believe that meant the little one understood. "Ethan," Talia said softly, "what if she's moved?" He knew who she meant. Mara, the lioness. He had watched her for weeks from a distance. Watched the way she settled her cubs, the way she let them climb over her face and tug at her ears without a single snap or swat. He had seen lionesses before, plenty of them. Some careful, some fierce, some impatient. Mara was different. There was a patience in her that didn't quite fit the wild. Still, he wasn't foolish enough to pretend he knew her heart. She was a predator through and through. "If she's moved," he answered quietly, "then we find that out. And we rethink. But if she's still there, and we walk away without trying, we're the ones who failed him." Talia hugged herself, the chill creeping into her sleeves. "I keep hearing my professor in my head," she said. "Never interfere more than you must. Never gamble with a life on a guess. This feels like more than a guess, Ethan. It feels like we're pushing him toward a cliff and hoping there's water down there." Ethan shook his head, eyes fixed on the acacia grove ahead. "No. The cliff is behind us. He's already falling. We're just trying to throw him a rope from the only place we can reach." They stopped near a small rise where the grass dipped and then rose again toward the trees. This was close to where Ethan had last seen Mara, under a fallen acacia, two cubs nursing, while she kept one half-closed eye on the horizon. He lowered the gorilla from his chest just enough to look at his face. The baby's eyes were half open, unfocused, the dark lids heavy. The lips moved in a ghost of a suckling motion, as if trying to find something that wasn't there. Ethan could see now how sunken the cheeks had become, how the fur near the chest was damp with sweat and shallow breaths. Talia pulled out the satellite phone again, as if some part of her still believed technology could swoop down and save the day at the last possible second. She held it up, turned slowly, searching for a scrap of signal. The screen flickered with a single bar, then none, then one again, like a dying firefly. "Come on," she whispered. "Just one call, just one." She tried dialing the mobile clinic. The phone thought about it for a long moment, then went dark. Battery empty. The last hope of a safe human rescue died with that little blinking icon. For a long beat, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the restless hiss of the grass and the beating of Ethan's heart in his ears. Finally, he slid the useless phone from Talia's hand and tucked it into her pocket. "That's our answer," he said. "We're on our own now." Talia stared at him, anger and grief tangled together. "You talk like this is fate," she said, "like the world set this up and all we can do is follow along. But what if we're wrong, Ethan? What if she tears him apart and we have to stand there and watch? I don't know if I can live with that." He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the scared young researcher, but the woman who had come all this way because she believed life in the wild still had something worth saving. "You think I can?" he asked quietly. "You think I haven't replayed every animal I couldn't save in my head at night? But I've also watched nature do things no book ever predicted. I saw Mara stand between a wounded impala fawn and a pack of hyenas and snarl them off. Tell me that wasn't madness. Tell me that made sense." He shook his head. "We don't get to write the rules out here. We just get to decide whether we show up." A soft movement drew their attention. The baby gorilla's head had rolled to the side, and for a horrible second Ethan thought it had stopped breathing. He pressed his ear close, straining. There it was, a whisper of air, but weaker now, like a candle burning on the last of its wax. The tiny hand twitched again, not in strength this time, but in reflex. The body was giving up. "We're out of time," Ethan said, his voice rough. "We choose now. Either we set him down and walk away, pretending we did all we could, or we trust the one mother out here who still has milk, warmth, and room in her heart, even if she doesn't know it yet." Talia closed her eyes. For a moment, Ethan thought she might turn back, leave him to carry the burden alone, but when she opened them again, there was a different light there. Fear, yes, but something stronger underneath. "If she kills him," she whispered, "I'm going to hate you, and I'm going to hate myself more." Ethan nodded. "If we do nothing and he dies in my arms," he said softly, "I'll never forgive myself either." They stood in that quiet agreement, the kind that doesn't feel like peace, but like the only path left on a cliffside. They climbed the small rise and looked down into the shallow hollow where the acacia trees bent over the earth. The fallen tree lay where Ethan remembered, a gray carcass of wood, its trunk split and leaning like an old man's spine. Beneath its shade, he could just make out movement. Two small shapes tumbling over each other, light-colored, playful. The cubs. His pulse jumped. "She's here," he breathed. Talia followed his gaze and saw, at last, the curve of a tawny flank, the slow, steady rise and fall of a lioness's breathing. Ethan felt the gorilla's weight in his arms like a clock winding down. He knew the next few minutes would mark them both for the rest of their lives. Carefully, he stepped forward, down the slope, every instinct telling him to tread lightly, to respect the invisible line between safety and wildness. At about 20 yards from the den, he stopped. "This is as close as we go," he said, more to himself than to Talia. He knelt and with hands that Shadat had steadied rifles and held sick animals and buried more than he cared to remember. He began to ease the baby gorilla down into the soft, cool grass. The little one stirred, just enough to open his eyes a fraction, dark and glassy. For one heartbeat, those eyes met Ethan's. There was no understanding there, no language, just a raw, simple question. "Will you leave me again?" Ethan swallowed the tightness in his throat. "I'm trying, kid," he murmured. "I'm trying to find you a mother." He gently uncurled the tiny fingers from his shirt and laid the small hand on the ground. Then he stood up, feeling older than his years, and backed away, step by slow step. Beside him, Talia's hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. When they reached the edge of a patch of taller grass, they stopped and crouched low, hidden but close enough to see. The savanna around them felt strangely hushed, as if every creature within earshot was waiting to see what would happen. The air cooled another notch. The shadows deepened. Time, for that one moment, seemed to hold its breath with them. Down below, one of Mara's cubs lifted its head, sniffing the air. It turned toward the small, dark shape lying alone in the dust. Then, with the clumsy bravery of the very young, it tottered forward on oversized paws. Ethan felt Talia's fingers dig into his arm. "No time," he whispered, voice barely more than air. "No chance, unless she says so." And with that, the fate of the baby gorilla passed out of human hands and into the heart of a lioness they barely knew. The little cub's curious steps sent ripples through Ethan's nerves. The young lion, hardly steadier than a toddler, sniffed the air again and ambled closer to the small, dark shape lying in the grass. It wasn't fearlessness that carried him forward, just the unquestioning boldness of the very young. Ethan held his breath, watching the cub pause a few feet from the baby gorilla, tilting its head with innocent confusion. For a moment, it simply stared, its tiny tail twitching like it wasn't sure whether to play or sound the alarm. Then it let out a soft chirp, a high squeak of sound that bounced off the fallen acacia and disappeared into the quiet dusk. That sound reached Mara before anything else did. The lioness stirred beneath the shade, lifting her head slowly at first, then all at once as instinct surged through her muscles. She rose with a grace that seemed too smooth for something so powerful, her tawny coat catching the last orange streaks of the sun. When she saw her cub standing apart, standing near something unfamiliar, her body shifted into a stance every ranger knew too well: alert, protective, ready. Even from the distance, Ethan could see her ribs expand as she inhaled, cataloging every scent the wind carried. Talia pressed closer to him, barely breathing. "She knows something's wrong," she whispered, but Ethan didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the lioness, watching the way her ears twitched, her tail stilled, and her gaze locked onto the small shape near her cub. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. It was the silence before a storm, the kind that warned every living thing to stay very, very still. Then she descended the small rise like a shadow slipping through tall grass, slow, controlled, deadly. Her body stayed low, each step melting into the earth. The cub, still curious, chirped again and stepped aside as if presenting the strange visitor to his mother. Mara reached the baby gorilla and lowered her head until her nose brushed the ground inches away from him. She inhaled sharply, a deep breath that seemed to draw in the entire moment. Ethan felt every muscle in his back tense. Talia dug her fingers into the dirt, eyes wide with dread. "This is it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "She's going to." But Mara didn't bare her teeth. She didn't growl. She didn't swipe. Instead, she exhaled, a long, low breath that eased the tension in her shoulders. She lowered herself further, her massive head nearly touching the ground, as she nudged the baby gorilla with the side of her muzzle. It wasn't a shove or a test. It was gentle. So gentle, Ethan felt something break open inside him. The baby stirred, barely, its small hand twitching. Mara's eyes softened in a way that seemed impossible for a predator carved by wild years. Talia blinked hard, as if not trusting what she was seeing. "Ethan," she breathed, "why isn't she attacking?" His answer came low and almost reverent. I don't know." But he did know something. Mara had made a decision in that moment, one not written in instincts or survival guides. Something in the tiny, broken creature had touched her in a place older than hunger, older than fear. With a soft grunt, Mara opened her jaws. Talia gasped, covering her mouth. The lioness reached down and took the baby gorilla by the scruff of his neck, not with the crushing power of a hunter, but with the precise hold of a mother lifting her own newborn. She raised him carefully, adjusting her grip as if aware that one wrong move could shatter him. The cubs bounced excitedly behind her, chirping and brushing against her legs as she turned toward the den. Ethan's chest felt too tight to breathe. For a long moment, he couldn't move. He couldn't even speak. He had imagined this moment 1,000 ways on the walk here, and none of them had looked like this. Mara walked back beneath the fallen acacia, carrying the baby gorilla just as she did her cubs. She disappeared into the cool shade with him, and for several seconds The den was silent. Then came a sound Ethan never expected to hear, a soft, rhythmic rumble vibrating through the ground and into the grass. Mara was purring, not the deep, demanding purr of a mother lion calling her cubs, but something softer, almost fragile, layered in warmth. Ethan leaned forward slightly, tears burning his eyes without warning. He had never heard a sound so gentle come from a creature so fierce. Minutes passed before Talia dared to speak. "Do you think she's accepting him?" Ethan nodded slowly, still stunned. "It looks like it." Talia wiped her face with trembling fingers. "Ethan, this shouldn't be possible." He gave a small, breathless laugh. "Most things worth remembering never are." They stayed crouched in the tall grass as the light faded into dusk. Through narrow gaps between branches, Ethan could see glimpses inside the den. Mara lay curled around the baby gorilla, her cubs pressed close against her sides. Every now and then, she groomed the little outsider with slow, deliberate strokes of her tongue, cleaning him, warming him, claiming him in the only language she knew. The tiny creature nestled closer, his frail body disappearing into her golden fur as if he had found the warmth he had been searching for all along. Talia watched in awe, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's treating him like he's hers." Ethan nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the den. "It looks that way." Mara shifted, lifting her head slightly, and for a brief moment her gaze swept across the clearing, golden eyes glowing in the dim light. Ethan felt a shiver run through him. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a threat. It felt like acknowledgement, an unspoken agreement between man and Lioness, a shared moment of recognition. As night settled over the plains, Ethan placed a gentle hand on Talia's shoulder. "We should go," he said softly. "We've done all we can. The rest belongs to her now." They rose from the grass, careful not to make noise, and started the long walk back toward camp. The air had cooled, but neither of them felt the bite of the evening wind. Their minds were still back in that den, replaying the impossible moment they had witnessed. Behind them, under the brittle skeleton of the acacia tree, Mara curled her body protectively around her cubs and the tiny gorilla, wrapping them together in a circle of living warmth. The savannah, vast and unforgiving, had made room for a miracle. And though Ethan didn't know it yet, this miracle would soon draw danger back into their lives, danger darker and closer than either of them imagined. But for that night, against every law of nature, a lioness had chosen mercy, and a dying baby gorilla slept for the first time without fear. The night passed slowly, like an old man turning in his sleep, and Ethan barely rested at all. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mara lifting the baby gorilla in her jaws, saw the gentleness of it, the impossibility of it, and some part of him feared that, come morning, he would wake to find it had all been wishful thinking. Hope was a dangerous thing out here. It warmed you just enough to make the cold feel worse when it came back. By dawn, he had given up on trying to sleep and sat outside his tent, staring across the plains toward the acacia grove hidden miles away. Talia stepped out a little later, rubbing her eyes. She looked worn, unsettled, as though her mind had spent the night arguing with itself. She offered Ethan a cup of warm water, they were saving the last of the fuel, and sat beside him on the overturned storage crate. For a long time, neither spoke. The early morning light thinned the shadows, painting the grass in pale gold. Birds chattered softly somewhere in the distance, unaware that Ethan's world felt like it was hanging by the thinnest thread. Finally, Talia broke the silence. "Do you think he made it through the night?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched a lone zebra wandering across the field, its stripes almost blue in the dawn light. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but if he didn't, I doubt we'll ever see Mara near that den again." Talia hugged her knees. "You think she'd abandon her cubs?" Ethan shook his head. "No, but she'll move them. Lionesses do that when something feels wrong, if she sensed danger, or if something happened to the baby." He didn't finish the thought. Talia didn't make him. They set out just after sunrise. The walk back to the grove felt longer than the day before, every step filled with the weight of questions neither of them dared say out loud. The wind was colder that morning, brushing against their faces with a kind of sharpness that made the plains feel more unforgiving, more honest. The savannah didn't hide the truth. Not for long. When they reached the rise overlooking the fallen acacia, Ethan held up a hand to stop Talia. Her heart slammed in her chest as she scanned the area, searching for the familiar shapes of cubs playing in the dirt, or Mara stretched out lazily as she often did in early morning. At first, she didn't see anything. The den looked empty, deserted. A hollow pit formed in her stomach, squeezing tight. But then a tail flicked. It was small at first, just a tiny swish of motion behind a cluster of tall grass. And then, like sunlight breaking through a cloud, one of the cubs tumbled out from behind the trunk of the fallen tree. It pounced on nothing at all, then rolled over as its sibling swatted at it. Talia exhaled so sharply she almost laughed. The cubs were alive. They were still here, which meant, "Where's Mara?" she whispered. Ethan pointed. The lioness was lying half in shadow beneath the curved spine of the tree, her back facing them. Even from a distance, they could see the steady rise and fall of her ribs. She looked peaceful, more peaceful, in fact, than Ethan had ever seen her, and nestled against her side, almost invisible in the golden fur, was a tiny, dark shape. Talia pressed a hand over her mouth. The baby gorilla was alive. Not just alive, but curled against Mara like a natural part of her family. The lioness nudged him with her muzzle, then groomed him with slow, sweeping strokes. He twitched, shifting closer, pressing himself deeper into her warmth. Ethan felt something heavy lift from his chest, something he hadn't realized had rooted itself there overnight. They edged a bit closer, staying low. Mara lifted her head briefly, ears twitching. She didn't growl. She didn't tense. She simply looked toward the horizon as though greeting the morning, and then lowered her head again, content to stay exactly where she was. She accepted him, Talia murmured. She really accepted him. Ethan nodded slowly. Not just accepted him. Look how she's lying. Mara's body wasn't curled around her cubs the usual way. She had shifted, angled herself so that the smallest body, the most fragile, was pressed directly against her stomach, where her warmth was strongest. Her cubs were nestled near her hips, but the baby gorilla rested right at her core, as if she had instinctively chosen to protect him first. "That's a maternal position," Talia said. "That's not instinct. That's choice." She shook her head, trying to piece together what she knew of lion behavior. This shouldn't be happening. She shouldn't be doing any of this. "Maybe should doesn't mean much out here," Ethan said quietly. "Maybe nature isn't as rigid as we think." As the sun climbed higher, the cubs grew restless. One began nudging the baby gorilla, pawing gently at his shoulder as if inviting him to play. The little gorilla made a soft sound, weak but more alive than yesterday, and lifted his arms slightly. The cub chirped, delighted, and batted at him again. Talia clasped her hands, unable to hide the hope rising in her chest. "They're trying to include him," she said. "They're already treating him like a sibling." But just as quickly as her hope rose, worry followed. The cubs, though gentle now, would become stronger with each passing week. And they didn't know their own strength. One careless swipe could break a bone. One playful bite could puncture skin. Ethan could see the thought flicker across Talia's expression. "We'll have to watch him," he said softly. "If she keeps him, we bring the med team out here when we can. We make sure he survives this miracle." Then it happened, the moment that would stay with Ethan for the rest of his life. Mara stood, not quickly, not abruptly, but with a careful, deliberate rise. She stretched one front leg, then the other, and nudged her cubs to step back. Once the area was clear, she lowered her head to the baby gorilla again. Ethan tensed, unsure what she was about to do. Even Talia stopped breathing. Mara pressed her forehead to his. A slow, steady press. Not rough, not curious, not territorial. Affectionate. Intimate. Ethan had seen lions rub their cubs before, but never like this. This was something deeper, a gesture of bonding, of claiming, of offering comfort to a creature that wasn't her own. The little gorilla reached, out with both hands, touching her cheek. His fingers trembled as they brushed her fur, and then he clung to her the way he might have clung to his real mother if she were still alive. Talia wiped her cheeks, not bothering to hide her tears. "Nature stopped," she whispered. "Just for a moment, nature stopped to make room for that." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat. "That's the moment," he said softly. "Right there. That's when the world decided this story wasn't going to end the usual way." For a long time they simply watched, two humans crouched in the grass, too humbled to move. The sun rose higher. The cubs wrestled. The wind carried dust and birdsong across the plain. And inside the shade of a fallen tree, a lioness and a baby gorilla rested together like a family. Ethan knew deep down that the peace of that moment wouldn't last. The wild never let miracles go unchallenged. Danger always returned, and sooner or later, something, or someone, would threaten the fragile life Mara had chosen to protect. But as he watched her curl around the baby gorilla, her cubs nestled against her back, he allowed himself, just for a minute, to believe that maybe, just maybe, the savannah had decided to give this strange little family a fighting chance. And somewhere behind that quiet hope, a shadow was already moving back into their world. Morning came with a soft heat that rolled across the plains, warming the dew on the grass and stirring life into the savannah. Ethan and Talia returned to the den just after sunrise, expecting to find Mara resting as she had the day before. But what they saw instead made both of them stop in their tracks, struck silent by a scene that no ranger's handbook had ever prepared them for. The cubs were awake, fully awake, bounding around the den in their usual clumsy way. But this time, they weren't wrestling with each other. They were circling around the baby gorilla, sniffing him, nudging him, batting at the ends of his fur, with the careful, unsure touch of siblings meeting a newborn. The little gorilla sat upright in a wobbling posture, blinking at the cubs, as though trying to understand why these golden, fuzzy creatures kept bouncing around him like overexcited children. Then one cub rolled onto its back in front of him, paws waving in the air, inviting him to play. Talia pressed a hand against her chest, overwhelmed. "They're socializing him," she whispered, "just like they would another cub. They've accepted him already." Ethan didn't answer. He was watching something else, something more subtle, yet more powerful. Mara had positioned herself just behind the gorilla, not beside him, not in front of him. Behind him, like a shield. Every time a cub got too excited, too close, she extended a paw, not in warning, but in a gentle reminder, guiding them back with a soft push. She was regulating the play, teaching boundaries, teaching patience, teaching them how to treat the fragile new member of their family. "Look at her," Ethan murmured. She's protecting him from her own cubs. She's prioritizing him. Talia shook her head slowly. This is beyond instinct. She's choosing him, Ethan. She's choosing him. As the morning stretched on, the strange little family settled into a rhythm. The cubs wrestled. The baby gorilla watched them with brightening eyes. Every so often, he tried to mimic their movements, raising his small arms, rocking forward as if preparing to pounce, only to collapse gently into Mara's fur, and each time he did, Mara curled her body around him, steadying him, her tail brushing his back as if reassuring him that he was safe. It was during one of these moments that something unexpected happened, something small but important, something Ethan knew would one day mean the difference between life and death. The baby gorilla reached up and groomed Mara, just a few small movements of his fingers through the fur on her cheek. A gentle plucking motion like he was helping her clean herself. Ethan's mouth slowly fell open. That's affiliative behavior, he said. That's gorilla bonding. He's treating her like a member of his troop. Talia nodded, her eyes shining. And she's allowing it. She's not even blinking. But the true turning point came around midday. Ethan and Talia had retreated to a safer distance, close enough to observe without intruding. The sun had grown warmer, the kind of heat that softened the air and made even predators drowsy. Mara stretched out on her side and drifted into a half-sleep, her cubs pressed against her belly. The baby gorilla toddled clumsily toward the shade, trying to find a comfortable spot to settle. One of the cubs, a particularly feisty one with a white tuft on his ear, pounced at him just a bit too hard. The gorilla fell backward with a startled cry, a weak sound that cut through the warm air like a knife. Mara's eyes snapped open. She lifted her head and, in a motion almost too fast to follow, hooked her paw gently but firmly around the cub's waist, pulling him back. Not a rough pull, not a scolding strike, a correction. A mother teaching one child how to treat another. The cub mewed softly, confused, but complied. Then Mara turned to the baby gorilla and nudged him upright with a tenderness that didn't belong in a predator's vocabulary. He reached for her immediately, his tiny hands gripping the fur at her chest, and she accepted the gesture as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. She's not just protecting him, she's raising him. Talia exhaled, her voice barely a whisper. This family, it shouldn't exist. None of this should be possible. Yet it was happening right in front of them. As the afternoon wore on, something else changed. The little gorilla began exploring. First just a few feet, then a few more. He grabbed at leaves, pulled at grass, climbed awkwardly over a fallen branch. Each time he wandered too far, Mara followed. Not always close, sometimes 10 or 12 steps behind, but always watching, always ready to intervene. That's how lionesses treat cubs that are old enough to wander, Ethan said. They give them space, but they stay close enough to protect them. Talia smiled softly. He's learning to move like a cub, and they're learning to accept someone who isn't one. Still, not everything was peaceful. Right before sundown, the feisty cub with the white-tipped ear seemed to have reached his limit. Maybe he was jealous. Maybe he wanted his mother's attention back. Whatever the reason, he approached the gorilla again, ears forward, tail stiff, body language uncertain. The little gorilla looked up at him, not frightened, just tired. And then the cub lifted a paw. Talia inhaled sharply. No, 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 stop. But before the cub could touch the baby, Mara moved. One swift step, one low growl. Not loud, but firm, the way a mother scolds a misbehaving child. The cub froze, ears flattening. His paw dropped. He backed away, chastened. The message was clear. The little gorilla was not a guest. He was hers. As the sky darkened and the temperature dropped, Mara gathered her small family close. She arranged the cubs near her hips, where her warmth was steady but not intense, and she pulled the baby gorilla against her stomach, curling her body around him like a living blanket. Ethan watched in stunned silence. She's reorganized her entire sleeping pattern for him. Talia nodded. That's maternal prioritization. Lions don't do that for outsiders. They barely do it for weak cubs. The sun slipped below the horizon. The air cooled, and in the dusk, under the shelter of the fallen acacia, a family the world never meant to create settled in for the night. But far beyond their small circle of warmth, danger was moving, quiet, steady, and far too familiar. Tracks had been spotted miles away, boot prints, tire marks. A signal Ethan and Talia had hoped they wouldn't see so soon. The night riders were back. The warning came just after dawn, carried on the crackle of Ethan's two-way radio. The static broke, then cleared, and Ranger Douglas's steady voice filled the air, tighter than usual, edged with concern. "Ethan, you reading? We've got fresh tracks near the northern flats. Motorcycle treads, heavy ones. Multiple sets. Looks like they came in late last night." Ethan felt his stomach tighten, a heaviness settling against his ribs. Douglas didn't need to say the name. There was only one group reckless enough to ride those trails under cover of darkness. The Night Riders. Talia froze halfway through packing their gear, the color draining from her face. "They're back?" she whispered, eyes widening. Ethan nodded slowly. "Looks like it." She looked toward the horizon as though the bikers might come, roaring over the hills at any moment. The image of the broken baby gorilla from days earlier flickered through her memory, the terrified animal dragging itself across dry earth. She clenched her jaw. "Ethan, they weren't just passing through last time. They targeted something. Someone. What if—" He already knew where her thoughts were going. He felt them in his own bones. Mara, the cubs, the baby gorilla curled against her stomach every night. A fragile family hidden in the den beneath the fallen acacia. Human cruelty, reckless and blind, had already shattered that baby's world once, and now it was coming back. Ethan strapped on his radio harness and grabbed his binoculars. "Let's go," he said. "We need to check the den before anything else." Talia followed, her steps quick and anxious. The savannah was quiet in a way Ethan didn't like, too calm, too still, as though the land itself sensed what was coming. When they reached the rise overlooking the den, Ethan crouched, motioning for Talia to stay low. The grove seemed peaceful at first glance. The sun filtered gently through the cracked branches of the acacia skeleton. The cubs tumbled near the shade, batting at each other with clumsy enthusiasm, and Mara, steady, regal, unshakable, was stretched beside them, her eyes half closed as she watched her children play. The sight of the baby gorilla lifted a weight off Ethan's heart. The little one had grown stronger in just a matter of days, sitting up more easily, using his hands to explore the dirt beneath him. Mara watched him with a kind of steady vigilance, nudging him back into her shadow whenever he strayed too far. But the peace didn't last. A distant rumble rolled across the plains, low at first, easy to mistake for thunder. Except the sky was clear, and the sound grew louder, sharper, splitting into the distinct growl of engines. Talia's breath hitched. "That's them." Ethan didn't argue. He could already see dust rising beyond the far ridge. Not one bike. Several. He pulled Talia down beside him, lowering their silhouettes behind the tall grass. "We wait here," he whispered. "If we run to the den now, we'll lead them straight to Mara." Talia swallowed, tears stinging her eyes. "Ethan, if they get too close—" "I know," he said softly. "I know." The bikers came into view moments later, roaring across the flats in a loose formation. There were 4 of them, maybe 5. They swerved in sweeping arcs, scanning the land with predatory confidence. One carried a rifle strapped to his back. Another had a chain coiled at his hip, used for dragging carcasses, Ethan suspected. Their laughter carried sickeningly across the open plain, carried by the breeze like a taunt. Mara lifted her head. Her ears twitched. Her jaw tightened. The cubs froze in their play and scurried toward her instinctively. The baby gorilla blinked, confused by the sudden tension in the air. Mara nudged all 3, young ones close, and rose to her feet, her body forming a protective curve around them. "Ethan," Talia whispered urgently, "she knows something's wrong." "Yeah," he murmured, "and she's preparing." The night riders slowed near a patch of low brush, scanning the area like men who believed every inch of the savannah belonged to them. One man cut his engine and signaled to the others. They dismounted, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Ethan watched them spread out like a hunting line, each step deliberate, each motion trained. They weren't just wandering, they were tracking. Talia pressed a hand over her mouth. "They're looking for lions." Ethan nodded. "And Mara's den is directly in their path." A surge of panic rose inside him, but he forced himself to stay still. If they ran now, they'd expose the den. They had to wait for the moment the bikers committed, wait for the point where Ethan could intervene without putting Mara or her young in greater danger. His pulse hammered in his ears as he watched the men advance. Mara stepped fully out of the den. Her body became a shield, broad, steady, unyielding, blocking the entrance behind her. Her tail flicked once. Her gaze sharpened. The cubs huddled behind her legs. The baby gorilla clung to her fur, instinctively pressing against the safety of her warmth. Talia trembled. "She's going to defend them." "She has to," Ethan whispered. "She knows what's coming." One of the bikers spotted movement in the distance. Maybe Mara shifting her weight, maybe the subtle motion of cub ears flicking in fear. He lifted a hand, signaling. The others raised their rifles, scanning the brush with predatory focus. Ethan's heart slammed painfully against his ribs. He reached for the radio. "Douglas, we've got visual confirmation. They're armed. They're close to a den, Lioness with cubs. We need the team now." Static. Then Douglas's voice. "On our way. ETA 10 minutes. Ethan's jaw tightened. 10 minutes was an eternity. The bikers advanced. Mara growled, a low rolling sound that vibrated through the ground. Not a roar. Not yet. A warning. A promise. The men laughed among themselves, mistaking the sound for nothing more than a territorial threat. They didn't know they were standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than they understood. Talia grabbed Ethan's sleeve. If they get any closer, and then it happened. The man in front raised his rifle, not at Mara, but over her head, testing her reaction, trying to see how far he could push before she charged. Mara didn't move. She simply stood, unshakable, her body the last barrier between her family and the men approaching. The baby gorilla let out a tiny, frightened cry. The sound was small, barely more than a whimper, but Mara heard it. And in that instant, something inside her shifted. She stepped forward. Just one step, but one that echoed across the plains, across Ethan's chest, across the widening eyes of the men foolish enough to challenge a mother protecting her children. Talia whispered, "Oh God, she's not going to let them anywhere near him." Ethan swallowed hard. "No," he said, "she's not." And farther off, unseen, shadows moved again, silent but deliberate. A male lion had heard the cry too. The engines died one by one, leaving behind a thick, uneasy silence. Dust drifted around the night riders' boots as they tightened their formation, rifles shifting into ready position. Ethan watched them through the tall grass, every muscle in his body wound tight. The men had no idea what stood between them and the den. Not just a lioness, but a mother whose protective instinct had grown fiercer with each day she cared for a child not her own. And somewhere beyond the tree line, the shadow of something larger had begun to move. Mara stepped forward again, just far enough that sunlight brushed across her face, revealing the tension building inside her. Her ears angled forward, her whiskers flared, her lips curling just enough to show a sliver of fang. It wasn't a challenge yet. It was a final warning, one any experienced hunter would have understood. But these were not hunters. They were thrill-seekers with rifles, adrenaline, and a reckless belief that the wild belonged to them. One of the bikers, a tall man with a shaved head and a red bandana, raised his rifle a little higher. Not to shoot, not yet, but to test the boundary. He took a single step forward. Mara mirrored him, stepping out of the shadow fully, muscles rippling beneath her coat. The cubs pressed themselves deeper into the den, but the baby gorilla didn't hide. He clung to the edge of Mara's flank, tiny fingers splayed in fear, eyes wide and glistening. That one small motion, that soft, desperate gesture, triggered something ancient and primal inside her. Mara lowered her head, and she roared. It wasn't a lioness's roar meant to intimidate prey or warn rivals. It was deeper, sharper, carried by a fury no natural law could name. The ground trembled beneath Ethan's knees. Birds scattered from nearby trees in frantic bursts. Even the night riders flinched, rifles jolting slightly in their hands as the raw power of that roar slammed through the air. Talia grabbed Ethan's arm. "She's calling for help." He nodded, eyes scanning the ridge behind the den. And she might get it, because Mara wasn't alone out here. The male lion had been circling the territory for days, a big, scarred wanderer, unfamiliar but unchallenged. Ethan had glimpsed him twice from afar, broad-shouldered, slow-moving, a loner by all appearances, but loners listened when lionesses roared like that. It was a summons as old as the savannah. The night riders didn't back down. They regrouped, shoulders tightening, expressions hardening under the weight of whatever bravado kept them standing there instead of running. One of them shouted, "Keep your lines, she's just bluffing." Another barked a laugh. "One lioness? We've taken down worse." Ethan clenched his teeth. They don't know what they're dealing with. Mara roared again, this time shorter, sharper, her tail lashing the ground. The baby gorilla whimpered and pressed closer to her leg. She shifted her weight, placing herself squarely between him and the rifles. The men began to spread out, forming a semicircle to flank her. That was their mistake. A rustle of grass, quiet but deliberate, sounded from the left, then another from the right. Talia's breath caught. "Ethan, tell me that's what I think it is." He didn't dare speak. His eyes were fixed on the shadow forming near the ridge. Something massive was moving toward them, its silhouette cutting slowly through the haze of heat rising from the earth. The male lion appeared. He stepped into the clearing with a thundering authority that made even the cubs whimper inside the den. His mane, thick with dust and age, glowed amber in the afternoon light. He surveyed the scene with an expression Ethan recognized instantly, detached calculation, shifting into an unmistakable resolve. He wasn't here for the bikers. He wasn't even here for Mara. He was here because he'd heard the cry of a child, not just a cub, but something else. Something he had no name for, yet instinct told him belonged inside the circle of protection. The men saw him and faltered. The one with the bandana muttered a curse, taking a half-step backward. Another man quickly re-aimed his rifle, panic starting to creep beneath his bravado. "We got 2 of them now," he hissed. "Back up! Back up!" But it was too late. Mara took advantage of their hesitation and moved forward, roaring again, her voice blending with the low rumble rising from the male lion's chest. The 2 sounds struck the air like twin thunderclaps. The night riders stumbled, disorganized. And then everything happened at once. A gunshot cracked through the savannah, sharp, violent, deafening. Talia gasped, hands flying to her mouth. The bullet hit the dirt just inches from Mara's paw, spraying dust into the air. She recoiled, more surprised than hurt, and the cub shrieked inside the den. The baby gorilla buried his face in her fur. Mara's eyes narrowed into slits of burning amber. She stepped forward. The male lion stepped with her. Side by side, they formed a wall of golden power, their roars rising into one unified sound that swallowed the gunshot's echo whole. The ground shook beneath the force of it. The night riders scrambled backward, tripping over each other, rifles rattling. Ethan didn't wait another second. He grabbed his radio. "Douglas, move in! Move in now! Shots fired! We need you on the flank!" The reply came instantly. "We're coming in hot. Hold position." The bikers tried to retreat, but the male lion lunged first. Not fully, not attacking, but a warning charge so explosive that the nearest man dropped his rifle and ran. The others followed in blind panic, crashing through brush, scrambling toward their bikes. One shouted, "Forget it! Go! Go!" Engines sputtered, then roared to life. Dust exploded behind them as they tore away, fleeing the ridge in frantic, zigzagging paths like terrified prey. Ethan rose slowly from the grass as the lion pair watched the bikers disappear across the plains. Mara's breath came fast, her muscles trembling with leftover adrenaline. The male lion remained still, regal, unshaken. Then something remarkable happened. He looked at the den, not at Mara, not at the cubs, at the baby gorilla. And in a gesture that defied every rule of nature, the male lion lowered his head, a bow, an acknowledgement, a silent acceptance. Talia whispered, awestruck, He's protecting him too." Ethan could only nod. The male lion turned and walked toward the brush, disappearing as quietly as he had come. Mara, still trembling slightly, returned to the den. The cubs rushed to her sides. The baby gorilla lifted his arms toward her, seeking reassurance. She touched her nose to his forehead with the tenderness of a mother who'd nearly lost her child. Behind them, the sun dipped lower, painting the world in orange light. Ethan and Talia watched in silence, two humans witnessing a scene that would outlive every one of them. A lioness, a baby gorilla, and a male lion who had chosen to stand guard for reasons no science book could explain. The wild had taken a stand. And it had chosen family. The night riders never returned to that part of the savannah. Ethan learned later that Douglas and the other rangers had intercepted them miles away, arresting 3 and sending the rest scattering like frightened jackals. But in the quiet that followed that chaotic day, the land settled back into its familiar rhythm, wind moving through grass, the distant cries of birds, and the steady thrum of life carrying on. For Mara and her strange little family, the days that followed were gentler. The danger had passed, at least for the moment, and the cubs regained their playful boldness. The male lion, who remained a puzzle even to Ethan, lingered at the edges of Mara's territory, never entering the den, but always close enough to be felt. His presence was like a silent guardian, a watchful shadow with a roar powerful enough to shake the earth when needed. Some lions protected territory, some protected pride, but this one seemed to be guarding something else entirely. Weeks slipped into months, the seasons shifting in the subtle ways only rangers and wild things know how to read. The air grew warmer, the plains dried, and the little gorilla, Mara's adopted child, grew stronger. He learned to climb first. His tiny hands, once trembling and weak, gained enough strength to grip the low branches of the fallen acacia. The cubs watched with envy, chirping and pawing at the trunk, frustrated that their own paws couldn't take them where the strange sibling could go. He learned to forage next, tugging at leaves and inspecting flowers the way young gorillas were meant to do, except he always brought his findings back to Mara, as though seeking her approval for the smallest discoveries. Mara watched him with a patience that astonished even Ethan. She let him wander farther each day, but she never let him wander alone. If he climbed too high, she nudged him down. If the cubs grew too rough, she stepped between them. If he grew tired, she carried him by his scruff, awkwardly, carefully, placing him gently beside her as though he were made of something fragile and precious. And the bond only deepened. One afternoon, Ethan and Talia watched from the rise as the group settled for a nap under the broken tree. The cubs dozed against Mara's side. The baby gorilla curled himself against her stomach, his head resting where her heartbeat was loudest. Mara laid her chin on his back, eyes half closed, breathing deeply. Talia whispered, "She loves him, Ethan, not just tolerates, loves." Ethan nodded. "I know." But as the gorilla grew, another truth settled over them, a truth as unyielding as the savanna itself. He did not belong here forever. He needed others of his kind, a gorilla troop, a family who could teach him the things Mara could not. Ethan had known this from the beginning, but knowing didn't make the reality any easier. And so the day eventually came when they had to make the decision, the kind that tears at a person's insides no matter how right it might be. The transfer was arranged quietly. A sanctuary team from the south prepared an isolated habitat where the young gorilla could learn to socialize, to climb higher trees, to eat the foods meant for him. They scheduled the move for early morning when the savanna was calm and Mara's den still wrapped in the softness of dawn. Ethan and Talia approached slowly, walking the familiar path toward the rise. The air felt heavy, the kind of heaviness that comes before a storm, not of weather, but of emotion. The cubs stirred first, blinking at the humans. Mara lifted her head next, watching them with steady eyes. And the baby gorilla, now stronger, brighter, full of life he never should have had, ran toward them with unexpected confidence, reaching out as if greeting old friends. Talia knelt and held him gently. He pressed his forehead to hers, the way he did with Mara. Ethan swallowed, turning to the lioness. We're taking him somewhere safe," he said softly, as though she might understand the words. "Somewhere he can grow with others, like him." Mara rose slowly, her movements calm but deliberate. She approached the baby gorilla, nudging him once, twice, her whiskers brushing his cheek. Her eyes held no anger, no panic, only a quiet sadness, deep and steady, the kind that lives in a mother who knows she cannot keep the child she raised. The baby gorilla reached for her, small hands gripping at her fur. Mara leaned her head down and pressed her forehead to his, just as she had the first day she claimed him. The gesture lingered. Ethan felt the sting of tears. Then, with a slow inhale, Mara stepped back. She eased him forward with her head, gently, firmly, pushing him toward Ethan the same way any mother nudges her young when it's time to leave the nest. No growl, no resistance, just acceptance born of love. Talia couldn't stop crying. Ethan couldn't speak. Together they lifted the young gorilla and carried him toward the transport truck, waiting beyond the ridge. Every few steps, the gorilla looked back, calling softly. And every time, Mara answered with a quiet rumble from deep in her chest, a promise that she was still there, still watching, still loving him, even as he left her world. 6 months passed. The gorilla thrived. He joined a small group of rescued juveniles, learned to climb taller trees, learned to forage properly, learned what it meant to be part of his own species. But some habits never left him. He still leaned his head into the chests of caretakers when he was tired, still slept curled in tight little balls like a lion cub, still purred, not exactly but something close, when he felt safe. Then came the day Ethan returned. He wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe the gorilla would be too wild now to remember him. Maybe he'd hide. Maybe he'd simply ignore the man who had carried him through the worst of his life. Instead, when the gate opened, the young gorilla rushed forward and wrapped his arms around Ethan's waist. Talia laughed through tears. Ethan held him close, overwhelmed by the weight of memory and miracle. The sanctuary team had arranged something rare that day. Supervised wilderness reintroductions for the gorillas who had bonded deeply with their early caregivers. Ethan led the young gorilla out onto the edge of the plains, not far from where Mara once lived. The wind shifted, the grass parted. And Mara appeared. Older now, a little thinner, but still radiant and strong. Her cubs, nearly grown, followed behind her. She stopped when she saw the gorilla. Her ears tilted forward. Her tail stilled. Then she stepped closer. The gorilla froze, staring at her. Then, with a small, incredulous sound, a sound halfway between a hoot and a sob, he ran to her. Mara braced herself as he pressed against her chest, hugging her the way he once did as a tiny, dying infant. She lowered her great head and licked his forehead, her tongue sweeping gently across the familiar dark fur. She remembered him. Of course she remembered him. And then the bushes rustled again. The male lion stepped out, larger than Ethan remembered, mane thick and sun-bleached. He approached slowly, his eyes soft, not predatory, not territorial. When he reached them, he bowed his head to the young gorilla in the same quiet greeting he had offered months before. A lioness. A male lion. A gorilla who should never have survived, standing together like a family reunited after too long apart. Talia lifted her camera, hands trembling, and captured the moment, the kind of photograph that travels the world and becomes a symbol of something people can't quite put into words. Not instinct, not logic, not nature as textbooks describe it. Something deeper, something older. Ethan stood beside her, watching the impossible reunion unfold. "You know," he said softly, "some things out here aren't meant to be explained." Talia nodded, tears in her eyes. "Some things are just meant to be believed." And as the wind moved gently through the tall grass, carrying the soft rumble of a lioness's purr and the quiet hoot of a young gorilla grown strong, the plains seemed to echo a truth the world often forgets. Family is not written in blood. It is written in love, and in the courage to care for someone who does not look like you. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart even a little, just drop a simple 1 in the comments. No long message needed, just a 1 to let me know you're here, listening, and sharing these moments with me. And if you'd like to walk with us through more stories of courage, kindness, and the wild's unexpected miracles, please consider subscribing. There are many more journeys waiting, and I'd be honored to share the next one with you.